Hey, gorgeous. All you lovely ladies, we're so glad you're back for our third group of Heart and Hustle Portraits of Fearless Faith with Girl Gang. We're so glad you're here. We're so glad that you're still pressing in. I hope you've been enjoying the study so far. I am Brandy Cortez Hickson, and I'm the content coordinator with Girl Gang, and that means that my job is to put together some of the best material that we can find for you to help to kind of get you in the Word and studying who God is and who He says you are. If this is your first time here with us, we're so glad that you're here. You have not missed anything too much, nothing you can't catch up on. And that's the great thing about this study, is because we're studying these women and these character attributes, this change that's made in them, one person at a time. You can really jump in anywhere and be part of the conversation and part of the study. We're studying this week about identity. We're talking about Rahab, and if you don't know who Rahab is, she was an Old Testament prostitute. I wish there was a better way to say that, or a more, glamorous lifestyle or a more glamorous profession that I could tell you about, but that's really who she was. It's who she was when we find her, when we come up to her in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. And just to give you a little bit of background about the history and how she comes into this story that God is writing, it is part of the time where the children of Israel have come out of Egypt in captivity, and the leadership has transitioned from Moses over to Joshua and the tribal elders of that day. And Joshua and Caleb were two of the leaders, the younger generation, who said, we can go where God is asking us to go, and we can defeat our enemies, and we can be part of this process of stepping into the promised land. And that's kind of where we find them in this story. There's a city called Jericho, and Rahab and her family live there, and it is walled off. It is a fortress type city. Its strongholds are incredibly secure. It had a great military presence and very strong. And it was also a city that was full of idol worshipers. And idolatry is one of the biggest sins we find in the Old Testament. It's honestly one of the biggest sins we still struggle with today as human beings. But that's kind of where we find Rahab living with her family in this time, running a house of ill repute. She was a prostitute. Joshua wants to send some spies into the city, and he says to them, go to the house of Rahab, find a place where you can kind of be secure and under the radar. Now, keep in mind that we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are sitting just outside the walls of this city. So the kings and the military leaders of Jericho had to have had their eye on this massive group of people. They had to have known, their scouts had to have told them that, look, there's a whole nation of people waiting to kind of breach the walls of our city and to kind of take over. So they were keeping their eyes out for strangers coming in and out of the city. The best place to hide would have been a house like Rahab's. It would have been a place where men could come and go in an anonymous fashion and never really have to answer to who they were, where they came from. When we talk about Rahab and we talk about her profession and her identity, what I want you to realize is that, first off, God did not condone her profession, nor was it something that we are going to not talk about. She's mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament as part of this great lineage, and we're going to talk about how she got there. Before we get started too deep in that discussion, though, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you, who are you? How do you identify yourself? When someone walks up to you in a new conversation and they say, tell me a little bit about who you are. Tell me a little bit about who Brandy is. And what's your identity? What do you wrap yourself up in? It's very easy for us to wrap ourselves up in a number of different things. What we've done, who we've made, what other people call us, and our choices. I, as a mom, will often wrap my identity up in my children. I'm a mom. It's one of the first things I say to people. I'm married. I'm a mom. I have 4 kids. I have a business, as you can kind of see in the background. I've been a professional. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. And those are the things that I use to kind of identify myself. Identity is something that every woman struggles with at some point or another. It's like we feel like if we don't have some kind of title or some kind of grand thing to wrap our lives around or to profess to the world to show that we've done something, that our identity struggles. Like we've not accomplished anything, so we are not anything. The flip side of that is that sometimes everything we have done in the negative fashion, mistakes that we've made, choices that we've made, that we can wrap ourselves up in that identity. And I've done that too. I've been divorced twice. I used to be very heavily involved in drugs and alcohol and live a very promiscuous lifestyle before I came to know the Lord. And I, for a long time, wrapped myself up in the identity of failure and liar and loser and cheater. I've even wrapped myself up in the things that other people have called me. You can wrap yourself up in rejection. You're not wanted. Nobody wanted you. You're an orphan. You were a mistake. You were a waste of time. Maybe you've been in a dysfunctional relationship and you've been with somebody who told you that you were crazy or that you were ugly or that you were unstable. Maybe it's what you look in the mirror and see. You see fat or unattractive or old or wrinkly, or all the things that we want to tell ourselves negatively that impact how we see who we are. But there's something great about what God says about who we are and who He's made us to be that is really the crux of our identity that we have got to learn to grab hold of. We've got to learn to hold on with both hands and to hold on tightly. So before we move into talking a lot about Rahab and how she reclaims the identity that God has for her, I want you to take a second and I want you to write down in your journal or on your phone. And again, you don't have to share it with anybody. This is a safe space. But I want you to write down those things that you feel capture your identity. I want you to answer the question, who are you? How do you identify yourself? And after you've done that, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how God identifies you, how He claims you as His own. Don't be afraid. Again, this is just a little bit of time and it's just for yourself. And it's really just meant to kind of crack that door open in your heart and your mind a little bit more, a little bit wider, so that you can see exactly what is coming next for you. Are you ready? All right, take just a second. So now you've taken the time to write down your identity. I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that God can do something great with you? Or have you convinced yourself that everything you've done wrong is what will always define you? You know, we look at the story of Rahab and we look at what she did in her act, and this one simple thing, this little bit of bravery that she had, this one step of faith, and it's incredible to watch. It's incredible to watch this story unfold thousands of years later, because we have a perspective that she could not possibly have had in that moment. You know, she had heard the story of this God of Israel. She probably had more men than any of us care to imagine come in and out of her house. She'd had servants and guests and travelers and warriors and soldiers and, you know, traders all come through her home. And they had to have heard the story about this massive group of people that God had led out of captivity. She had to have heard. In fact, she tells the spies that she has heard the stories about everything that God has done and how He preserved them and how He rescued them from captivity, how He parted the Red Seas and brought them across on dry land, how He defeated their enemies and how He has set them in this place of favor. She'd heard those stories and she says that to them. The night they're staying in her house, before everybody goes to sleep, she goes up onto the roof and says, "We heard these stories, and when we did, our hearts melted. We want to be part of this. I want to be part of this." She's right in the middle of a city and a nation of people that have already decided that God's not worth loving and He's not worth knowing, and that they would never take the time to get to know Him. In fact, they had determined that once the children of Israel came in, that they would wage war on God's very own people. But not Rahab, not in her house, and not her people, not her family. She says in that moment, "I want to be part of this. We believe what you believe, even though we don't know. We're believing based on your story. And I'm asking that you rescue me. Give us a chance." God sees that act of faith, and He tells Joshua, and He convinces the spies in that moment to preserve Rahab and her family. When they come back in, several chapters in Joshua later, to take down the city and to conquer it, when everything else is destroyed, Rahab is rescued. It happens because of her simple act of faith. She did not let herself get wrapped up in the idea that, you know, I'm only ever going to be a prostitute, although there was probably a part of her mind thinking that we can just be that. We can live on the outskirts and I just want to live, not thinking for a second that God had a bigger plan for her. And He did. They come in, they take Rahab, and they bring her and her family to their camps to the nation of Israel. Now you have to understand that there was something incredibly specific about what God said that his people should and should not do with other nations, and being melded with them, allowing them to kind of fold into society, to intermarry with their people was not okay. He did not want that idolatrous, poisonous mindset to come into his nation. He brought them too far, and they had a purity that they had to maintain. They were to love God and love God only. He doesn't do that with Rahab. He doesn't rescue her to leave her on the outside. He doesn't even save her life, but not change her story. You see, that's not how our God operates. It's very easy for us to think that our human choices, our temporary choices, define us forever. And they don't, or they don't have to. That choice is ours. You see, we see ourselves with a very limited perspective. We look in the mirror and we see right now, and maybe we can kind of get a vision of 4 to 5 to 10 years into the future. We can make big dreams, but we can only see so far ahead of us. I could very easily get wrapped up in the fact and convince myself that because I'd had such an awful, awful past, that I had made so many mistakes, that God might save me, but he would never use me. And that's just not who he is. It's not what he wants to do. With Rahab, again, he did not care about her temporary human choices because he is so big and so all-knowing and so amazing that he saw who she was going to be. He saw what she was going to do. He saw a legacy that hadn't even begun to be written yet, but he knew it. And he knew the part of the story that she would have to tell was going to come down to this act of faith. He knew that when the spies went into that house, she would make that choice. She would say, I don't know him, but I want to know him. It's really important for us to remember that we are not the sum of all of our choices. You'll probably hear me say that again. I've made a lot of bad choices. But I look at my life and I look back and I think, God, you had such a bigger story, such a bigger thing for me. Rahab would become part of the lineage, of the bloodline of Jesus Christ. Think about that for just a second. This woman, this hooker, would become part of the family line of the Son of God, of the Savior of the world. Who she had been no longer mattered because it was wrapped up and redeemed by who God was going to turn her into and who she was going to be. He called her daughter. He allowed her to marry in to the Israeli bloodline. It wasn't even a matter of keep her on the outskirts. Ladies, you may have had an encounter, and for just a second I want to talk to those of you who have had that encounter of faith and you've taken that step out, but have somehow convinced yourself or confused the truth of who God is and thinking that you don't have a place in the story. You could not be more wrong. You have a place in the story. You are not an outcast of the citizens of the kingdom. That's not how this works. You were saved and rescued and redeemed for a purpose, to be part of this story. And it's a great story. You know, if God only ever did that with us, if he only ever took those of us that have been messy and broken and saved our lives, our eternal lives, but didn't redeem us for anything great and didn't use us in the story, do you realize that there would only be one citizen in the kingdom of God? One. And it would be Jesus Christ. It would be empty. It would be an empty kingdom. What king wants an empty kingdom? What king doesn't want to be surrounded by those people that he loves and that he has put blood and energy and rescue and great love into rescuing and to saving and to building? We don't serve a king who rules an empty kingdom. We serve a king who has authority and great love and dominion over a giant kingdom. It is full, and all of us have been broken, but we all have a story to tell. I wonder what would have happened if Rahab, would God have used someone else if she had said, yeah, I don't really care, I'm not interested? He probably would have. He had a story to tell, and he will bring characters in and out, but he didn't. He chose her, and he knew that she would be tender-hearted. She saved herself. She rescued her family. She changed her identity. Everything about her was different. When we hear the story of Rahab later and we look in the New Testament, we see that the old stuff is all gone. That when she's referred to as part of the lineage and the bloodline of Jesus, a woman of great faith because of this one decision she made to say, I don't know, but I want to know. And will you let me? Will you rescue me? That's amazing. 2 Corinthians 5:17 tells us that God makes all things new. That when we come to encounter him, he says, behold, I make all things new. The old is passed away. We're human, and as long as we have these human lives, we will always have these human stories, and we will have histories that go with them. But who we are doesn't have to be wrapped up in that. I'm not just a mom. I'm not just a divorcee. I'm not just somebody who's made a lot of mistakes and who has a lot of history and has paid a lot of the cost and consequences for those actions. I am a daughter of a king. I am redeemed. I am known. I am loved. I have a purpose. There is a plan. I am part of this big kingdom story. He met my heart and my hustle changed. The same thing happened with Rahab. The same thing can happen with you. That encounter, if you're willing to take that 30 seconds of bravery, that moment where you take all the stories that you've heard us tell you about who God is and say, I don't know, but I want to know. That's all it takes. You can get there. You can be part of this story. Who you are will change. You're going to go into your discussion time. And again, if you've been at these lessons, you know that these questions are deep, and we do that on purpose. We're not about to be shallow in our love for God or who he says we are. He is a big God, and he's called us to big things. So we're going to dig deep, and we're going to set deep roots and a strong foundation. If you can't get through all these questions tonight, it's okay. Take your time. Take them home with you. Write them down. Pray over them. Think about them. Look up what the Bible has to say about them. And then answer them to the best of your ability with your heart. And be honest and vulnerable with God. He's a gentleman. He's not going to beat you around. He's not going to condemn you. He's not going to dismiss you or discard you. He loves you. You are the most precious thing to him. And he has great plans for you. We're praying for you. We adore you. We are so glad that you are here, group after group, watching lesson after lesson. You guys can do this. You can go through this process. I have complete confidence in you. We love you. We love your group leaders. We love the energy behind every group. And we hope you guys have a great, great week and a great rest of the night. Take care now, and we'll talk to you soon.